Hello everybody, it's your friendly digital technology librarian Christy here. We reached another Friday, so of course I have another Film Rec Friday ready for everybody out there. Now, as you know, March is National Women's History Month, and we have been looking at themed recommendation weeks all month long. Last week we focused on women making history, and this week we are shifting to a couple of films all about women and Hollywood. Our first story is a film adaptation. The original work was by an American female author. The story itself is about four sisters, and the film is directed by a critically acclaimed director who also happens to be a woman. And our second story is a really interesting documentary that sort of does this cool deep dive into Hollywood witches and how Hollywood has sort of shaped our current viewpoint of witches, but has done the same thing throughout the decades. Both of these films are really, really excellent and are available entirely for free with your Milan-Berlin library card. So without any further ado, let's jump right into the recs. All right, our first recommendation is available via our CleveNet service on both DVD and Blu-ray, and that is 2019's adaptation of Little Women. Now, Little Women was originally written by transcendentalist author Louisa May Alcott. This was one of my favorite books when I was a kid. I just really, really loved the primary character, Jo, but I loved all of the characters, really, and there's something about the way that the relationship between those four young women is written. And then, of course, the relationships that all four develop with other people in their worlds, how each of them is such a very, very clear individual. You know, they're related and they have these core values and this inherent goodness, but they all approach and look at the world in a very, very different way. And I loved that. I loved that you could see yourself in all four of the characters, and you could still relate to all of the characters at the same time, even if one of the characters, you disliked or liked less than the others. And this particular adaptation, I think, does a really great job of blending both the source material as well as sort of like the meta workings of the world at the time when this was being written, and I'll get a little bit more onto that in just a few moments. So you've got four sisters in this story. You've got Jo, you've got Meg, you've got Beth, and you've got Amy. And of those four, your main character is Jo. She is this brilliant, independent young woman who is trying to figure out her way in the world. It's at this particular time, it's like the late 1800s, and women definitely have a stereotypical role to play in society. And Jo does not come from a family that is sort of forcing her into a particular role. They definitely are more, you find your own way, you exist as you need to, but society really is always the one that's sort of pressuring her. And Saoirse Ronan plays Jo absolutely beautifully. She does this phenomenal job of leaning into all of the different Jos of the past, because of course Little Women has been adapted so many times. I mean, you've got Katharine Hepburn playing a version of her, June Allison, Winona Ryder plays a version of her in the 1990s adaptation, and Ronan's character is definitely, influenced by these past performances, but is also its own thing. She just does a really great job of embodying what I think Jo was always meant to be. You have a really, really fantastic performance by Florence Pugh playing Amy, who has always been my least favorite of the sisters, but I think this adaptation does the best job of making her more relatable, at least in my opinion. I always had the least amount of empathy for her character, but she sees the world in a very different way than Jo does. And I don't know if it's just that I'm older at this point and understand that concept more than I did when I was a child or when I was a teenager or when I was a younger adult, but there is definitely something really relatable about Pugh's performance in this. Of course, you have a character like Laurie, which is situated as Joe's best friend, and he is played by Timothée Chalamet, who does an excellent job uh, playing opposite her. I do, and that's the other thing. The chemistry between all of these different actors is really, really solid. So you've got this cast that is really, really top notch. I mean, across the board, they all do a fantastic job. On top of that, you have an excellent adaptation, and then direction from Greta Gerwig. Gerwig has been this sort of indie darling for years now. She starred in this film Frances Ha back in the day, and she was just exceptional in that. And I don't know if it's the fact that she is a performer in addition to being a director, but this feels very much like an actor's film, and it's directed from that point of view. I think when you see the different scenes, I think her direction is more informed by understanding how the relationship between actors can function, and she just does an excellent job. This particular adaptation was really well lauded by critics. It received a ton of nominations through all of the different awards. It garnered several Oscar nominations, and I do believe that it won costuming. It was nominated for Golden Globes. It was an indie darling success across the board of festivals. I do think that this version is probably also the prettiest version as far as production values go. And I think it's probably for today's audience the most accessible in a lot of ways too. It feels timely because it definitely also delves into, and as I mentioned this earlier, what was going on at the time this book was being published too. So I don't want to offer up spoilers or anything, but there's a moment towards the end of the film where we really, really lean into that sort of meta world melding, and we see one of the characters sort of experience what Louisa May Alcott was also experiencing at the time, and none of the other film adaptations added that particular layer, and I really appreciated that. I thought that was a really interesting choice. It does not in any way detract from the original storyline. I do think that it kind of enhances and in fact explains away some of the ending notes that maybe people who aren't super familiar with Little Women's storyline already, that makes some of the ending notes a little bit more palatable, that may have been troubling in the past, at least that I know I have found troubling, and that I certainly found difficult to understand when I was a kid and did not know about all of that sort of meta publishing world drama that would also be going on. So you've got a fantastic film, which is an adaptation of a phenomenal and beloved female author that tells a story of four sisters, and that is adapted and directed by a woman. It's just there's just something very special about this particular adaptation. Saying that, I also would strongly recommend that people check out the 1994 adaptation of this particular story. 1994's Little Women was also directed by a woman, Gillian Armstrong. It starred Winona Ryder as Jo. You've got a phenomenal amount of chemistry between her and the Laurie character, who's played by Christian Bale. Maybe even too much chemistry, really. But honestly, I think novel readers may appreciate elements of the 94 version even more than the 2019 version. So certainly keep that one in mind. And it is also available via CleveNet on DVD. So again, if you are interested in a story that really has unbelievably solid acting, if you like interesting directing, if you love beautiful production values, because 2019's version is absolutely lush when it comes to costuming and things like that, make sure that you check out the Greta Gerwig adaptation of Little Women. It is exceptionally good, and I would call it a must-watch. Okay, my final recommendation for National Women's History Month is available via our Hoopla digital service, and that is the 2020 documentary, The Witches of Hollywood. I was not familiar with this documentary before this month, and I'm so utterly delighted that I found it. It is fantastic. Um, People who are interested in film history, people who are interested in folklore, people who are interested in women's studies, people who are interested in just Hollywood and the glitz and glamour of the different eras of Hollywood absolutely need to watch this because it is just such a fantastic little documentary. 50 minutes long, very, very, very fast watch, and it is a deep, deep, deep dive into so much subtext in the history of Hollywood's depiction of witches. There is certainly an element of academic analysis to this one. I 100% wouldn't say that this is for people who are not interested in deep diving into a subject, but if you do, we talk a little bit at the beginning of the documentary about sort of witches in general, the literature that's out there, the act like the I guess would you call it academic literature, say from the early eras when people were actively hunting witches, like during your puritanical era or even before, and talking about these manuals that people looked at as fact for how to identify a witch. I mean, if you're familiar with the Crucible and all of the stories about the puritanical witch hunting era, it's really, really interesting to see the images of the actual textbooks written about how they were to hold these sort of tribunals judging women primarily, because about 85% of the people who were judged witches were women. There were some men, but it really was definitely a women focused hunt. And how those sort of depictions of these evil crones, seductresses, things like that, how it has morphed over the years, and how once we got to the era of film, how film influenced how we viewed these particular characters so much. We dive into things like the idea of the dual witch, which they sort of focus on Snow White at the beginning of the documentary. It was one of it of course had the sort of crone or hag, that was a pretty typical image of what a witch was, someone old and sort of gnarled and hideous looking. The outside matched the intent, and you juxtapose that with her other half, this sort of vampy kind of glamazon, who used sexuality and seduction to gather power. It's interesting because that was not something necessarily talked about, how Hollywood really helped push the idea of the vamp witch, and what was behind the theory of that. These women who were seeking more power, especially in the 1930s, how a woman who was overreaching could be considered that kind of a vampy witch, and how, of course, she's a villain. And that's barring all of the other things that are going on in Snow White, but it's easy to latch on to that image of that kind of a woman being bad. How Hollywood took the way that we looked at women over the decades, and they were able to sort of imbue these characters with those characteristics, and it then informed the audience without even having to say an extra word. You didn't have to telegraph, this is a bad person, because you imbued that character with those bad characteristics, or the common consideration of what bad characteristics were, and how that has shifted over time. You have different characteristics being viewed as bad today than you did in, say, the 1930s or the 1940s, and how witches are very different. What's good and what's bad, and how these sorts of social context is a huge thing throughout the years as to how we view these particular characters. I would say the entire documentary moves very quickly because it does cover all of these different eras. So it's not one that you just have on in the background. I wouldn't say this is one that you want to sit down, you want to really think about, and you really want to pay attention to. But at the same time, that 50 minutes goes by so quickly because you get to see all of these different iconic female figures, and how when you really do a little bit of extra analysis, so many things sort of pop out, even things. And it's really cool because, as they're doing their own, this documentary is doing its own deep dive into the different characteristics and the different themes. It also makes you think a little bit more, and you see more of the subtext that they don't even mention, and you are able to make your own conclusions and extrapolate different characters that the documentary doesn't necessarily talk about. At the beginning you have these really black and white characters of like good, bad, and how those things are significantly more gray as time goes by. How we as a society is very much more interested in a lot of times those gray characters. More recently, you have characters like Maleficent, that are no longer simply like the dragon to be slayed. It is a fully fleshed out, very human character where we are more willing to look at those shades of gray. So we have a character that we can feel empathy towards. It's very, very interesting. As I mentioned, if you have a love of Hollywood history, legends and folklore especially, and that's one of those things. I've always been a massive, massive fan of folklore and legends regardless of where the story originated. This is definitely a documentary I would recommend to anyone. Again, it's only 50 minutes. It goes crazy fast, and it's got so much food for thought. And I thought this was especially good to be my last recommendation because, in addition to the whole concept of like Hollywood era glitz and glamour, the more academic elements, it's also a really interesting view as far as a women's studies kind of viewpoint. It really does make you think about how women are viewed, how what we are supposed to be has shifted over the years, and how those sorts of social constructs really affect the way we want to see women portrayed in film, television, uh, literature, and I think it's absolutely one of those films that you 100% need to watch. So again, available on Hoopla Digital, 2020's documentary The Witches of Hollywood. Absolute must watch. Okay, so that is it for this week, as well as it for the month of March and our National Women's History recommendations. If you have any recommendations about films with women's depiction via Hollywood, or any other films that you want to recommend that really focus on a more female viewpoint, please, please, please recommend those. Definitely would love to see some other films. If you have any recommendations for themes you'd like to see us cover in the future, also definitely recommend those in the comments below. As always, thank you so, so much for joining me. I've had such a delightful time making these recommendations lists for this month, and hopefully I will see you next week. Bye-bye.